Hi, everyone. Just want to let you know that we're going to get started in a couple minutes or so, let some stragglers come in, and then we'll get the webinar going. Thank you for attending. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar, which is the next in a series that we're starting back up called Discovering SBM. In this specific episode, we'll be diving into reporting with complex systems. My name is Dave Easter. I'm the Director of Product Management for SBM. And I'm really excited to have Matt Fraunhofer, Solutions Architect and SBM Guru, present to this topic today. Before we get started, let's go over some of the logistics. We are being recorded. All attendees will get access to the recording within the next 24 hours or so. We'll post access to it. There'll be some questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So if you have some questions, feel free to type it into the questions pane. You can ask those questions at any time, but we'll get to the actual answering of them toward the end of the webinar. So we're going to do this in as a short PowerPoint presentation, and then Matt's going to go into a live demo of the reporting with complex systems. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Matt.
Thanks, Dave. Good evening, or rather good morning, good afternoon to depending on where you're at, and I guess if we have anybody overseas, good evening to you. So today we're going to talk about reporting with complex systems. And one of my quotes that I just found a couple days ago really kind of helps describe what we're doing here. So a little conflict can create a lot of creativity. In this case, conflict is a kind of a bit of a misnomer. It's not really conflict, it's more of a challenge that we have. And what are those challenges? So HTTP basic authentication is kind of going away. More and more systems, especially modern SaaS systems, are going to different authentication protocols. They're using authentication microservices. So I need to create this token or generate this token automatically, and then I have to pass that token into all of my subsequent RESTful web service calls. It's not really necessarily a proper protocol, as you might say, but that's just how you work with our APIs. We've got data abstraction, so we use this within SBM, TSIDs. So the item identifier that might come back from a web service call may not actually be the human readable identifier for an item ID. We have these internal identifiers that come back, and the actual values are stored in a different table. We have lack of data consistency. So depending on the system that you're querying, you might get back all lowercase new value, a camel case new value, or all caps. Every system stores these items a little bit differently. And there's a ton more conflicts or challenges that we have with external systems and when we bring all those together. So how do we handle these types of challenges? Well, we can do direct database reporting. So within SBM, we provide several different methods of reporting against systems. One of those is the data service. So we can actually connect directly to a database and add a web services layer on top of these databases that may not actually have web services exposed. We can do the same thing with advanced reporting, but then we actually pull those and you're able to use our reporting engine to get back the actual data with a SQL query. And then we can use ModScript and RESTful web services. And that's a bit of an interesting one. Most people don't think about the ModScript engine in terms of being able to actually query other systems and use it to report off of that data coming back. So how would we actually do that? So let's first dive into what is ModScript. For those of you that don't really know what ModScript is, it was introduced in SBM in the 11.2 version, or maybe it was 11.3, I can't remember off the top of my head. But we've been improving it with every release and adding more features and functionality. So it's based on a scripting language called ChaiScript. It's based on ECMAScript, which is the basis for JavaScript, and it executes on the server side. So it doesn't take up any client, when you're thinking about client-server execution, it doesn't take up any resources on the browser side. All those requests are done from the actual server itself. And it's got contextual awareness to it. So it knows if you're trying to execute the script in the context of a transition, if you're directly invoking the script, if it's being invoked by a URL, for example. And so since we can invoke these scripts via URL, we can return back HTML, but we could also return back JSON. And JSON is kind of the de facto standard for web service calls when you're using the REST protocol. So we could do server-side integrations and processing of data. We could even go out to external DLLs, perform database-level integrations with SBM. We can execute external command lines, but then we can also insert dynamic HTML and JavaScript as well as generate JSON. So how would this actually work for us? So we're going to use ModScript as a proxy. So everything is as a service. In this case, ModScript is going to act as a proxy for us. So SBM can be invoked, the ModScript can be invoked by an SBM URL. So the user would invoke that URL, the user in this case being maybe a Kanban board. The script then executes, and that script is written so that we request the authentication token. The destination system would then send back that authentication token. We would then perform the RESTful web service call to retrieve the data set with that token in place in the payload. And so then we would send that destination system would then send back the data set that we need. And then our script would then process that data. And I realized I don't have a number 4, so number 5 should actually be number 4. ModScript then returns that data set back to the user. So when I say the script processes the data there at step 3, that could be anything from we just bring back what the service sent back to us. So if it sends back everything exactly the way we need it, we just needed to be able to handle that authentication, great. But in some cases, we actually might want to kind of format the data. So if we have any of those data consistency issues that we talked about, you might want to change from a lowercase low priority to a camel case to match any of your other data. Or you might want to trim off some sort of system value that's appended to the end. And we'll go through how we would do that within the ModScript itself. So what are we going to see today? We're going to see ModScript used as a proxy, and we're actually going to integrate with Micro Focus SMAX, stands for Service Management Automation X. A lot of our customers use SBM for ITSM, and it's a perfectly acceptable use case, but there's a bunch of other customers using SBM that don't use it for ITSM. And another ITSM tool out there is Micro Focus SMAX. So This was a good example. The tool requires that we generate an authentication token from its identity service, its identity microservice, and then we put that token into the header of any subsequent HTTP requests. And then we actually want to modify the data to normalize it to what we would see out of SBM. So in this particular example, it sends back its priority value, and it actually says low priority, high priority. Well, we already know it's a priority, so we can trim off that last priority off the actual value. And we'll go through how we do that. And then we actually want to show you how to return JSON from an already existing SBM report. So we have a JSON API and a couple different ways to accomplish that we'll show. So with that, we'll go ahead and pop out of the presentation and go dive into the tool. We'll wake up my virtual machine here. So you can see here, I've got a Kanban board. And for those of you that are not familiar with the kind of the layout of the Kanban board, you can see here I've got this little circle with a red circle with a slice through it. That means it's coming from an external data feed. In this case, it's coming from our SMAX integration. So let's look how we went ahead and built this. So to start out, we first need to create a REST data source for SMAX. ModScript addresses everything and can perform RESTful web service calls to REST data sources. They have to be defined in there. And so here we just have our URL here, https mars.itsma-x.io. Fairly simple. We give it a little bit of sample data. And so we can use that script or that data source in any subsequent scripts. But then you might say, well, that's great, but external data feeds in SBM also need to come from REST data sources. So what we've done is we've created individual data sources per the different reports that actually are going to directly come from SBM. So in this case, we have report 1 that we're going to be using today that actually uses the SBM server, and it uses our script page command, and it executes our SMA_X script, and it passes in a parameter called report 1. And that points it to the actual parameters within the URL that need to be passed along. So we've got then report 2 as well that utilizes that same script, and the script decides based on the report that's being passed in what parameters to use to generate the actual web service call. So let's go ahead and take a look at this script. So as we go through, we've got a function defined here called getToken. And so this is basically constructing the URL that we need to make a web service call to authenticate to SMAX. So we define that we want to have a auth object that gets sent as part of the body, and we need to pass it login. We give it the value of this username that we've gotten out of the REST data source definition, the password, and any tenant ID. It looks like we need to pass a tenant ID as well. And then our parameters for the URL, we have to pair those together, and that creates a map within ModScript. And there's our parameters. So the URL would end up being that mars.itsma-x.io/auth/authentication-endpoint/authenticate/login. That's our URL that we have to utilize. All we have to do is define that information, and then once we have that object, we can just we can issue our post command. So we issue our post, we pass along the token, which is what we're going to store. The auth, we turn that into JSON. So our auth object here, we're going to pass that along and convert it over to JSON as the body. We send along any parameters that need to go within the URL itself, and then the path params is what helps us build out the rest of the actual URL. And so then once we get that back, as long as it's successful, we're going to set our field value of token to the actual token. So in this case, we're storing this token in an SBM record. That way we can monitor the expiration time and then be able to store it for future use as long as it's not expired. And then we update the record with the lock. So that part is optional. You could go ahead and go to, you could go directly and process this every single time within the script if you want it less complex, or you can store it within the actual record itself. Now, I did see a question come in, and I'll just address it real quick. Are user IDs and passwords stored in the user SMAX reports table in clear text? No. So the benefit of storing the credentials within an SBM table is when you've got your data design, you can actually store the username and password as secure values. So they're just normal text fields. And in this case, our username is clear text, but you could easily check that and make it a password. But at the password level, we actually have checked, and it is a password field. So it is not visible by the end user, but the scripting engine is able to go back and get that directly from the SBM record, the actual value itself. It's a good question. So let's go back to our script here. So this is defined as a function. And then we have another function that is get data. So again, you can structure these scripts however you choose. In this case, we chose to just create different functions that do different things. So in this function, we're passing in the authentication token, and then we're also passing, and then this is the data that we're going to be returning. So this is the response that would be coming from this web service call. So we're going to grab our URL parameters for the given report. So we're going to find the report that we are looking for, in this case, report 1. We're going to grab our tenant ID, our REST entry point. We're going to construct our URL parameters. We're going to grab our path parameters, which in this case would be that mars.itsma-x /.io/rest, and then add the tenant ID and the entry point. And then our headers, this is where we pass in our authentication token. So we have to provide a cookie header with a value of lmsso_cookie_key equals, and then the token value. So all of these things are going to be heavily dependent on whatever system you're integrating with. So you have to understand how to interact with the API of that destination system. In this case, that's what's required for SMAX. If you're integrating with ServiceNow, any other tool, a financial management tool, Salesforce, etc., their APIs will behave differently and require different different authentication options, different headers to be passed along, but ModScript gives you the capability to change how you need to do, how the script executes, and add in whatever headers are necessary, whatever path or parameters are necessary to be able to integrate with those systems. And then what we do is we return the value that's returned when we perform our get HTTP call, with passing along the data, the parameters, the path, and the headers. And so then once we get that data, we do have this function here called process JSON. And this one I added to be able to actually remove the priority from the value. And so we'll use this a little bit later, and I'll talk through how it works. So then our script executes and makes sure that we pass along the appropriate values. So in this case, we need to make sure that we have our params object. So if not, we're going to say our script has to run with URL parameters. If it does not have the correct SMAX report value, then we're going to error out and say you have to specify that. Otherwise, if it doesn't have the value itself, then we're going to say, hey, you need to define a valid value. And then if we can't read the REST data source, which is SMA_X_server, then we're going to error out as well. And we're going to return all those directly to the browser or the executing system as JSON. So we create our object here, and then we call the to_JSON parameter or function. So if all of those don't happen, then we're good to go, and we're going to go ahead and grab the current token, and we're going to, if the token is empty or is not empty, we're going to go ahead and grab the data. Or if it is empty and it doesn't work, then we're going to go ahead and generate the token. We're going to perform our authentication. So that's where we do our get token web service call. And then once we get the token back, then we're going to perform the get data function call, where we actually pull the data that we're looking for from the system. So once we get that data back, all we're going to do initially is just write stream, basically back out to the calling system, which in this case would be a web browser or another tool that's executing the URL. So let's look at how this actually kind of manifests itself. So if we go back over here to Firefox, I'd like to use Firefox just because they have built-in JSON parsing within the browser itself. So when you make a web service call from there, as long as it's a GET request, then it will actually parse this out for you and show you the data. So if we just refresh this, we resend our request, we get an error. All right, there we go. So we resend our request, and that script executes. And it comes back and it gets all of this data. And basically, it's transparently bringing us back everything that was sent from SMAX. So we performed the web server, we got the authentication token, we performed the web service call to get the data from that report, and we just toss that data right back to the system. So you can see here, we're getting back all these different values. The current assignment is service desk, but here's that low priority. So our priority value for entity 0 in the array is low priority. Well, I don't really like having priority after all of these. So here's another one for entity 1 of the array, and we got a whole bunch of lows here. Let's see if we can find there's a critical priority. So you can see we've got all of these values, but they just append priority after them. Well, because I'm getting it from the priority field, I already know it's a priority, so I don't need to have this extra. And you can kind of see how it manifests itself in the Kanban board as well. So if we click on an object here that's in progress, you can see the priority data coming back, and it just shows low priority. I don't like the way that looks, and I want it to match my SBM values, which just say low and high and critical, etc. So let's go ahead and modify that script to actually call that kind of in place script that we had. So let's go ahead and comment this out. Oh, gotta work online. All right. And let me reopen this. All right, check it out. So down here at the bottom, we're going to comment just our transparent one, and then we're going to uncomment. And so what we're doing here is we're creating a new variable, processed output, and we're calling the process JSON function that we created, and we're passing it the output that came from SMAX. And then we're going to write out to the stream the processed output. And so what this process JSON is doing is we're passing it data, and then we're storing that data and we're turning it into a regular object within ModScript. So we're pulling out the JSON and we're putting it into an object structure of maps and vectors. And that's how ModScript stores all the data coming from JSON. So for every entity, for every object within the entity's object, in the object data vector, we want to grab that entity's value. We want to set the property's priority value. We want to set it to whatever the substring is, where we start out at 0, and we want to find where the priority starts. So we want to find where in the string that extra priority label comes in, and we want to turn that into a string, and we want to store that then as the replacement value. And then once we've gone through all those, we want to return all of that turned back into JSON. So let's go ahead and redeploy this. And once we're redeployed, we'll be able to see the JSON. We'll refresh our command. You'll see the output has changed, and then we'll refresh the Kanban board and be able to see the new values. So you can use this for any number of scenarios. So in this case, if say we needed to perform some calculations on some data to be able to return back, or if you have say it's a set of temperatures and you want to perform a Celsius to Fahrenheit conversion or any number of things, you could easily use the ModScript engine to go ahead and make that web service call for you, get the data, tweak it how you need to for your uses, and then expose that back to the SBM system. So our deployment of our process app is completed. Let's go back to our script here. We'll refresh. You can see now we've taken off that critical, the priority label off of that critical there. So now all of our data is coming back as we want. So medium is, instead of medium priority, it's just medium now. And we could do the same thing with process ID, or if we wanted to get adventurous, we could get the current assignment instead of service desk, all is one word. We could easily add a space within there. Or same within the phase ID of initial support, we could change that and put a space there. And let's see this manifest itself within the Kanban board if we refresh. Come on. And so now we have our priority low. And so that looks a bit more user-friendly and looks a little bit better, I think, to the actual end user of the system. So that's just one example of how you could use ModScript to kind of change the data on the fly, to format it to what you're expecting. Very, very simple to do. Relatively simple as long as you understand the API that you're working with. That is the most heavily dependent on the complexity, is how complex that API is to work with. So let's move on to our second demo. And in our case, we've got several reports defined within our system, such as this change requests and review. And for whatever reason, we want to be able to give this same data set out to as a web service call. So we want to be able to return this data as and reflect it as JSON. In this case with SBM, it's really easy to do. So if we hop over to this tab here, you can see we've got our URL here. And so all we have to do is address this report, but change the template. So when the URL, when we add a reference URL to a report, we have a keyword that gets added. So change requests and review. And that generates a URL that report can kind of be used independently. It doesn't have to run within the SBM system. It can run or be called from outside of the system as long as the privileges are set appropriately. But once we do that, we have this access to our template parameter. And so in our case, instead of, I believe it's just list is the normal one. Yep. So list would show us exactly what that report normally looks like within our environment. So we've got our grid, we've got our formatting, etc. But if we want to change this, we could change this to JSON. Let me actually just click on to JSON output, and we will actually return the JSON as part of the report. And one of the objects within the JSON is an array of results. And so every item that gets returned in that report is going to be sent back as a set of data. So all of our rows here show us, here's all the columns of our data. So we're going to return back the issue ID, the title field, the state field, the owner, and the reviewers. And so here is the actual data that goes along with that. And then our reviewers come back as an array. So this can be very helpful if you're trying to get, if you've got a report defined and you need to use that data to derive a web service call from, or that's the most reliable report you can find, you could easily give this URL to an external system. And as long as they perform the needed authentication for this report, or you've set the privilege level of the report to guest, then you can give them this URL. They can perform a get on this, and they can get back all of this data. There's also a way within our native JSON API to do this, and to actually just return back the items themselves through the JSON API utilizing this report. And all that is included in our API documentation. So with that, are there any questions? I haven't noticed any more coming into the session, but want to give people the opportunity to ask as many questions as they might have.
If you'd like to ask a question, go ahead and tap it into the questions pane, and Matt will be happy to answer it. I don't see anything new coming in, Matt.
All right. Well, let's find out how we can learn more about the different resources available to us. So let me hop back over to PowerPoint here. So our next few sessions that are coming up that will cover more details. On the 11th of July, we're going to have a session called So You Want to Integrate. This is one that I am particularly excited about. It's not going to be a largely technical session, mainly because integrations, while they have a lot of technical details around them, oftentimes the use case is what needs to be defined first. So during this session, we're going to be talking about what are the different things you need to think through when you're thinking about an integration. What system comes first? Who's calling who, etc. Because oftentimes, as a solution architect, when I go into a customer and they say, "Hey, do you guys have an integration to this?" Well, we can, but let's actually talk through the use cases and what you're trying to achieve out of the integration. Oftentimes that reveals more information that is more valuable to us. As the technical stuff, it's all code. We can figure out the technical side of an integration, no problem. Then on August 1st, the RESTful integrations with ModScript, we kind of did a little bit of that here today, but we're actually going to go in depth into when we have when we want to perform RESTful integrations with ModScript, calling out to a REST data source. What are the different things that need to be set up? When we get back JSON, how is it reflected? How can I process that within a script and actually go into detail around doing that with ModScript. On the 22nd of August, we're going to be talking about SBM and single sign-on. So one of the things that we have gotten several requests for is talking about how we can integrate with external identity providers, whether it be ADFS or other SAML2 identity providers. We're going to go through how you configure that, some of the things you need to consider, and then also show you an actual integration with another Micro Focus product, Access Manager. And then on September 12th, we're actually going to be doing a session on how to generate PDFs with SBM. One of the things that has been around in SBM for quite a bit of time has been our PDF widget. But a lot of people don't either know about it or think it's a bit more complex than it actually is. And so we're going to go through what it takes to configure that with a sample PDF form and put the data in there. So if you haven't gotten emails already on registering for those, you should be able to, you should be seeing that soon. And then we'll also have our Discovering SBM landing page updated so that you can go ahead and register for those. As always, if you have feedback for us, please let us know. Feel free to email me, myself, Matt Frauenhofer, or Dave Easter. Both of our email addresses are listed there. We want to know what you guys want to hear more about. What challenges are you having? And we can always add that into future sessions or help work with you one-on-one on how to accomplish what you're looking for. So what different resources do we have available for us to help us kind of get through and to actually perform these? So we've got our ModScript transition guide that helps explain the differences between AppScript and ModScript, and it helps give some details around some of the nuances of ModScript versus AppScript. We also have a ModScript reference guide that lists out all the details of the language and how to work with the SBM objects within it. On Serena Central, there's actually a really fantastic series of articles by the developer of ModScript, Don Ingram, that really goes into good detail and provides a lot of samples around how to use the ModScript language. So if you have not checked that out, please go out to Serena Central and find those blogs. They're usually featured pretty close on the front of the blog page, and he is constantly adding to that series. The support organization is always a good place to go if you're having issues with SBM or have any questions, and they can get you hooked up with the right resources. And then, of course, as always, your account team. So if you don't know who your account manager is, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Dave, and we'll be able to help out finding who that is. We definitely want to be engaged with you guys and help even just finding out what you're using SBM for, and try and help get the most out of the value for it. So with that, I want to thank you for joining, and if you guys have any questions or any feedback, again, please feel free to reach out to us at any point. We definitely want your feedback and want to make these valuable for you guys, our customers.
All right, well, this concludes the webinar on reporting with complex systems. We really appreciate your attendance here, and as mentioned, we'll get the recording out to those that couldn't attend very quickly. Thank you all for attending.